Welcome to the latest Peer2Peer podcast from Rayner. Today is a special celebratory episode because the EMV Toric IOL has been officially FDA approved for use in the USA. Personally, about 90% of the toric lenses or of all the lenses I put in are toric, so this should be a huge milestone for adoption of the EMV in the US. Outside of the USA, we've been enjoying using this lens since its launch in 2022. So we're going to have a chat about the lens with EMV Toric user and no stranger to the podcast, Allon Barsam, partner at OCL Vision in London, as well as Deb Ristvedt, cataract and glaucoma surgeon at Vance Thompson Vision, and a key study surgeon involved in the FDA approval. So welcome both Allon and Deb. How have you both been?
Good. Thanks very much for having me, Ben. It's great to be on this podcast with you and Deb.
Yeah, welcome back, Allon. Good to have you. And Deb, welcome to the show for the first time, hopefully not the last time.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's such an honor. And in the United States, it's early. So I'm so pumped that we all found a time to get together.
Yeah, welcome. FDA approval. I can't even imagine what that's like. I have patients in Australia who ask me if products are FDA approved because it has so much weight to it. And I always say, you don't want this to be FDA approved. It'll hold things back for years. It'll take forever to get through. It must have been a huge process.
There always is. And I look to you guys and Alan, you have it made where I'm looking to you in terms of what you're implanting, the results that you're getting. Because you're right, Ben, it takes forever to get something through the approval process. And again, that's why our passion for research here in the United States at Vance Thompson Vision. Because we get to make that happen. This process actually was really streamlined, and there's patients out there all over the place. You said you implant, 90% of your patients with toric IOLs. Well, why? Because that's the low-hanging fruit. Everyone has some sort of astigmatism, and can we manage that and make their refractive error even better yet? And so that was what was so fun about this study is to really, just kind of show that it's stable, that we didn't see misalignment on axis, that we got really good manifest refractions at 180 days, equivalent to the lenses that are on the market right now.
I think that these days, with looking at astigmatic outcomes and studies, one of the key measures that a lot of people look for is how many eyes were within half a diopter of residual astigmatism. Now, I know that the data won't be widely available yet because this is a very fresh FDA study, but just anecdotally, how did you find your patients, their results, who was sort of within half a diopter roughly? Were people doing well?
Results are so important when it comes to really meeting that target of less than a half a diopter. We know that. We know that visual quality is going to be best if it's less than a half a diopter of residual astigmatism. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the Rayner Toric EMV in our study, is that a lot of these patients are coming in with targeted outcomes of less than a half a diopter. And so that's really exciting. We have now data out to 180 days looking at this. And so my observation in our practice, being one of the highest enrollers, was just that. We saw quality of vision. We saw that the majority of patients did have less than a half a diopter of residual astigmatism. And then the other thing, that we were looking at was rotational stability. And so you'll see when the data is out there that we were looking for percentages of misalignment, and we were looking for patients that had less than 5 degrees of rotation. And I did not have to rotate any lenses in the study, so that shows you the stability.
That's impressive. I've found, and I'll ask Allon as well, I found that in surgery, the EMV Toric's very easy to rotate. And so when I started using it, I thought, oh, this is going to slip around. I'm going to see it tomorrow to be 90 degrees out. But it was easy to rotate, but then it stayed where it was put. Would you
Mhm.
agree, Allon?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's designed in a way that I think it has a higher compressive force at the equator of the capsular bag than many other lenses, and I think that's basically what locks it in place. But it means that at the time when the bag is more malleable when you're just operating on them. You can move it around a little bit, but and it will move one way and then the other, and it doesn't have a kind of like terminal bulb like some of the other lenses that are kind of, they have less compressive force from the haptic, so they have to have something there that kind of catches the capsule and stops the lens moving back. But with this lens, it's quite smooth. So when you're doing surgery, you can move it one way and then the other, which is quite helpful because, when you take viscoelastic out off from behind the lens, often the toric alignment will kind of jump, and it can jump by like 30 or 40 degrees. And then you've got no viscoelastic in the eye. And then having to spin the lens in a kind of clockwise direction all the way around can be quite laborious, especially when you've otherwise completed the operation safely. So, here you can move it one way, you can move it the other way. But once you leave it, that compressive force just locks it in place and it doesn't move. And rotational stability is unbelievably high. So it's from a point of view of kind of toric correction, it's a great lens.
I used to leave my lenses a few degrees off so that when I was removing the visco, it gave me a little bit of leeway to keep rotating. And then, if you went a few degrees over, I used to say to trainees, that's the walk of shame if you have to do another lap. But now I've changed it to talking about the victory lap, and that's a different story. But I do like that you can move the EMV back a little bit quite safely within the capsule. In terms of data points, I had been going to quote that there have been over 530,000 Rayner EMV lenses, but I have an ongoing ticker board of how many have been put in, and we're up to 600,000 that have been shipped worldwide of the EMV and EMV Toric. So there's a lot of numbers going out there, over 75 countries, over 18 peer-reviewed publications, over 250 presentations at meetings. I think I've done one of those. Allon, you've probably done many of those 250 presentations. Are you still finding that it's a very popular lens amongst you and your colleagues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, this lens, like lens technology changes all the time. So lenses come on the market and a year later, there's another lens, 2 years later, 3 years later. And what I found in my practice, and it might be because of, greater familiarity and greater comfort, but ultimately in my practice, as well as I know practice many other surgeons, all of this is ultimately driven by what patients want. But I'm just using it more and more. Like I'm just, I'm using it. It is basically my go-to lens. I use either the EMV or the EMV Toric in over 50% of all patients who I'm putting lenses into. And actually, the majority of those are getting the Toric version of the lens because I find that it's preferable to correct or eliminate astigmatism if possible with all lenses, but especially with the EMV. So I kind of, if you're gonna be deliberately inducing spherical aberration, you don't want to have residual untreated astigmatism. You want everything else to be neutral. So I use the toric version of the lens all the time, and I really love it. I'm using it increasingly more in situations where I otherwise would have thought, oh, maybe I'll use a monofocal toric here, but I don't. The EMV just seems to give additional benefit over a monofocal, and there are very few scenarios where I think, what, you'd be better with a monofocal. Where there are so many scenarios where I feel like the EMV is the better option for you. And we talk a lot about spectacle independence, but quality of vision is important, and losing any kind of natural range or natural zoom, which is what you get with a monofocal, is sometimes a step backwards for patients, whether they appreciate it or not. So this lens kind of overcomes that, and I love it for that reason.
Allon, you're probably one of the people in the world that's used this the longest. For anyone out there, probably US surgeons that this is maybe being introduced to, what is the history of this lens? Like, where did it come from? Why was it created? You're probably the best historian on this topic.
Yeah, well, I think that Graham Barrett himself would probably give you a better explanation, but it was really his brainchild, and I think one of the things that's cool about Rayner is that they're small enough to be nimble and be able to engage with new technologies, new innovations, innovative surgeons, but big enough to be able to bring something to market and get approval in the US with FDA approval, which is a really extensive process. So they worked with Graham Barrett, who basically was his brainchild to use spheric aberration, and really I think he had always in his practice he liked the idea of monovision as a way of improving the level of spectacle independence, and this technology is designed in order to facilitate that. And so, he is a big proponent of using it with different levels of monovision. But actually, in the early days when I first started using the lens, I was using it with a zero refractive target aim. And I imagine in the study, you were probably given quite a tight leeway in terms of how much, how far away from zero you're able to go with respect to myopia. So, it works really well. Also using it just as a planar as an improvement on what a monofocal would be. But it does lend itself to mini monovision, and patients tolerate it really well because of the spherical aberration. And I think that, the term aberration is something that people feel uncomfortable with. They kind of think, oh, what are you doing? You're distorting the vision. Are you doing stuff that patients aren't going to like? And we forget that the human eye has all kinds of spherical aberration built into it. The cornea induces some, the natural lens induces some. So, spherical aberration is quite beneficial. And it's almost like a kind of a U-turn in the optics of, if we talk about history, in the optics of what's going on with IOLs, because the original lenses were all spherical, and then people said, that isn't giving people the best quality of vision. We need to use aspheric lenses to kind of, and those lenses will neutralize any kind of corneal spherical aberration. So you end up with a kind of like aberration neutral optical system. But the problem with that is you don't have any depth of focus. So patients might have this quality of vision, this good distance vision, but they cannot see anything at the intermediate. And we live in such an intermediate orientated world now. Like what we're doing right now is on intermediate vision. Every time people pick up a device, their screens, the way that their cars drive, we're not in a distance world anymore where we're outside kind of hunting, gathering. We are living in an intermediate world. So if you can make a patient 20/20 at 6 feet and beyond, but they can't see anything any closer, that's really frustrating. And that's more frustrating in 2025 than it would be in 2010 even. So, intermediate vision and near vision are really important for patients now with the kind of visual demands of technology-driven life.
And I've heard from people much smarter than me, Graham Barrett, Damien Gatinell, mention that the combination of positive spherical aberration with myopia is really sort of one of the optimal optical outcomes in terms of giving depth of focus. So like you were saying, although it's an aberration, it can be used positively. Obviously, you need to think, does this cornea have already excessive positive spherical aberration? You don't want to add to it. And so it does add a little bit more thinking in terms of your lens selection, I suppose, but it's never really been an issue for me. I've never really seen an eye where I think that wouldn't be appropriate for an EMV. How do you think it'll fit into workflow where you are? Because I know that Advanced Thompson Vision especially is sort of a gold standard in terms of efficiency, workflow, behind the scenes, on stage, off stage, all these sort of terms. Do you think that it'll add extra diagnostics, adding this into your armamentarium and lenses?
I think it's going to improve our options, actually. We have a lot of patients that travel quite a ways to come see us. And so, when I think about what's the ideal, we've talked a lot about Dr. Barrett today, and he always says there's no free lunch in optics, right? We all know that saying. And it's so true. We have to give and take with different IOL technology. And, the time it takes for us, for our optometrists to explain the different options to the patients can be quite confusing. And so, I always think, wow, if we can have a lens that gives good quality of vision without compromise and also gives what we've been talking about, a little bit of extended range of vision, it's kind of a slam dunk, honestly. And so when we're talking about, what patients do for a living, what they want their quality of life to be like, if, they want to be able to be spectacle independent, this just fits so well into our armamentarium already. And it's interesting when you look at the defocusing curves of different IOL technology. And will this lens, I guess my question is, will this lens maybe provide more of a bucket for patients that we're individualizing with multiple different IOLs? Meaning, we look at Vivity, extended depth of focus. This lens actually is pretty comparable when you aim for about a half a diopter in, the non-dominant eye. And so again, we have lenses out there that have, kind of the affordability of using sphere collaboration. But the way that this lens is designed, with having the central part being the most positive and then kind of being able to elongate it in the optics so that at nighttime you have better quality of vision, is also really key, because nighttime distance is really what we struggle with in our unhappy patients.
Yeah. And Allon, for you, when you introduced the EMV into your clinic, was introducing the EMV Toric a whole nother step, or it just came naturally because in London where you work, it's just part of the process where if you're going to have this premium lens, I'm going to correct your astigmatism as well?
Yeah, no, I mean it was more the latter, and I was kind of eagerly waiting to be able to use the toric version of the lens, because it became apparent in the kind of early months that there were some patients that don't like, with the EMV, they have the astigmatism uncorrected. It does unmask blur, as in for them to see clearly, they need the astigmatism to be corrected, which is not a huge surprise. I mean, that's what we might expect anyway, but I think that is especially true of this lens. So my advice for new users is always to have actually a low threshold for using specifically the toric version of the lens. Things are getting more expensive, but this is not a lens that's come to market as a kind of super expensive lens, even as though, as you say, compared to the Vivity, for example, which is, I know, the most commonly used, let's say, increased range of focus lens, the differences are very minimal, but the cost benefit when you look at the EMV is huge.
Deb, what do you have for tips and tricks for those US surgeons thinking about starting with the EMV Toric?
I think that the technology is pretty straightforward when it comes to implantation. There's different lens designs, and so I feel like, like we talked about today, the ease of rotating this lens is really nice. Being able to get all the viscoelastic out underneath the optic is always important, regardless of which lens you use. And so there's not much of a difference when it comes to implanting this lens, when it comes to our skill set. But the biggest thing is, just looking at the design and looking where the toric markers are, making sure that you align. I love to use Aura still. I don't know if you guys use that in Australia. There's a lot of different ways to look at, eye markings to make sure that you're right on axis. I love Aura because it confirms what I've been looking at, and then it really helps me align that axis. And so I think the biggest thing for tips and tricks is really making sure that you're getting these lenses on axis if you're treating toricity. So if you're treating that sill. Other than that, besides getting that viscoelastic out underneath the optic, is really making sure that, if they do have misalignment, that you're looking back to say, okay, can I rotate this early, to make sure that they get the best quality of vision? Because, for me personally, I love to be able to rotate the lens and use, the back calculator to say, okay, I want this even better yet before going to a laser fine tune. So the more we can prevent laser fine tunes and touching the cornea with premium IOLs, I think the better. Because you talk about, Ben, the quality of the tear film. That's huge when we're, looking at, optics and clarity of vision. So just really making sure, again, that you're being particular when it comes to alignment.
And I think this is a simple tip, but for anyone that's a little worried about starting with torics, a really simple cheat code is if you look at their refraction and the spherical equivalent of their refraction is near zero, you could rotate that lens to a better position to get rid of any residual astigmatism. So say minus 0.75 plus 1.5, spherical equivalent 0. I know that if I've got a toric lens inside that eye, I can rotate the lens to a better position. And it doesn't necessarily mean going to the original position, because after you've made an incision in that cornea, it is a different eye. That's different to what you planned on. So I think that's really right, is, always assessing that toric, looking at the axis and thinking to yourself, could you improve that situation? And I've got to say, I'm not just saying this because it's a Rayner podcast, but I've never rotated an EMV toric. So that's good news. Um, Allon, any tips or tricks yourself for the EMV Toric?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest, I have a few, but the one that I think is most helpful is that most patients have some, cataract patients have some level of asymmetry in the level of their cataract, which can make it difficult to try and figure out what the dominant eye is. Obviously, if the cataract is similar and the level of vision is similar, then it's a little bit easier. And then maybe they may have a history of ocular dominance, which can help you. But um, what I tend to do in cases where you're not sure, like either you can't assess it because the cataract's asymmetrical, or you have maybe a monocular cataract, is providing the keratometry is similar, which it often is. It's very rare for patients to have very different kind of mean K values between eyes. But what many patients have is a difference in axial length, which means that many patients have a kind of naturally wired into their brain from early life level of monovision, which might be kind of +1 in one eye and 0 in the other, but they have a natural difference in which one eye is naturally more myopic or less hyperopic than the other eye, and that's the eye that I will target a bit of myopia in, and it just does unbelievably well in that kind of scenario, in that situation. And you can also fine tune the level of myopia that you drive in based on what that difference is, because you get a little bit of a feel when you look at the biometry side by side, and you look at like what the numbers would be. You often find actually that by putting the same power lens into both eyes, it might predict that one eye ends up -1 and one eye ends up plano. And that's because the kind of -1 predicted eye has a longer axial length. So once you start looking at axial length and prediction, you're thinking about the eyes in that way, and you think that actually some level of difference in refractive, in spherical equivalent is natural for patients, and then you then achieve that with surgery. It's low hanging fruit. It's a large sweet spot. It's really a no-brainer. So that would be my number one tip for this.
Target monovision on every patient?
Not for every patient, Deb. I have quite a number of patients who say, look, my life is distance to dashboard, and and there's a few patients where no matter how much you explain, monovision does generally work. Even my dad has monovision, and he's nearly as pedantic and annoying as me. They will still not be able to get their head around the idea of the two eyes being different. And so there are a lot of patients who are quite happy distance to dashboard. I will often sneakily make one eye just a little bit touch myopic compared to the other one, just in terms of targeting maybe 0 and first minus. But in general, if I am targeting monovision, I usually do go with a decent amount of monovision, just because I do think with any lens, refractive targeting is tricky. And so I'll usually go about plano and maybe -1, -1.25. What about you, Allon?
Yeah, so I in patients where you don't want to get into a monovision discussion, or where they're very clear on they don't want monovision, or you feel like monovision would be a problem, again, like you, I'll sneak in between -0.25 or -0.5 without even mentioning it to them in the non-dominant eye. But my go-to is normally between -0.75 and -1. In patients that had a monovision trial, or who really want to be, totally independent of glasses, like a lens replacement patient, where I feel like a full range of vision lens wouldn't be appropriate for whatever reason, like the eye's too dry, or some other factor that would exclude them from that, then I'll go for more than -1, like -1.25, -1.5. You never need to do more than that, because the lens has 1.5 diopters at least of natural, built-in increased range of focus. But I would say that, a sweet spot for surgeons who are starting off with this lens, just to get a feel for it and to convince themselves that there aren't quality vision issues, that patients are happy, would be like -0.25 to -0.5. That'll give patients intermediate vision. And then if you want to try and push greater levels of spectacle independence, -0.75 to -1.
And Deb, were you allowed to, in the trial, aim for a little bit of myopia?
Nope, it was closest to plano. But still, we saw a lot of great intermediate vision, which is nice.
So, Allon, in terms of calculating any toric lens, but especially for the EMV toric, US surgeons may not be used to using the ray trace IOL calculator from Rayner. It's something you're familiar with. Would you be able to talk us through what that is and how people might be able to use it?
Yeah, I mean, the ray trace is basically the online calculator for working out toric lens power with Rayner lenses. It's very intuitive. It works very similarly to other platforms that they might have familiarity with. It just wants you to input, the key values such as K values and axial length. And it will then recommend the best lens power. It gives you a kind of spherical equivalent, refractive power, cylindrical power, and it tells you and works out the axis that you need to implant the lens at. And it will then illustrate all of that for you on a diagram so you can kind of see it. If you want, you can have it up in the OR. It's a very nice tool. It's very straightforward. They've done a lot of work actually, Rayner, to kind of redevelop, relaunch, improve it. And then the latest and newest version of it is fantastic and super easy to use.
Well, I was wondering if, for the new surgeons out there that are thinking about the EMV Toric, especially in the US, do you have any sort of final thoughts or takeaway messages? Do you have anything that you'd particularly like to sort of tell them as one of the lead investigators? You'll be responsible. You'll go down a history as being responsible for this lens coming to the US. No pressure.
Thanks, Ben, so much. No, but I can honestly, I don't speak to things that I don't believe in. And truly being part of this study was such a gift. And I'm really, really excited for the rollout of this lens because I think that it affords so many options for patients looking for depth of focus who want quality of vision. And that's really what we want. We want to do the right thing for our patients. And you guys have talked so much today about, it's not just one focal point anymore. We have patients in a new era that really are on their phones in a technology-driven world. And so even though, they're telling us one thing, we as doctors have to be responsible for being able to interpret that and really look at their quality of life and quality of vision. So I think my advice would be get excited, guys, because this lens really does afford the opportunity to be able to treat more patients and to be able to use a premium IOL that's going to give us the ability to treat astigmatism, the ability to give more depth of focus, the ability to, not worry so much sometimes about decentration and quality of vision because it's a forgiving lens.
Yeah, that's great. Allon, you've already said a lot of tips, tricks, experiences. Any messages for those fresh US surgeons thinking about the EMV Toric?
No, I think you just try it and you'll like it. It's one of these lenses, you just need to get going with it. We've talked a little bit about the ocular surface. It is important to make sure you get your kind of biometry measurements right and you're comfortable with that. I always advise surgeons to make biometry the first measurement you take of a patient's eye. You do that before you've checked the vision, before you've done refraction, before anything's happened to the ocular surface that makes it suboptimal. So get the biometry in first. And the other thing is referrers really like this lens. We get referrers saying, will you put an EMV into this patient, maybe target a bit of monovision, because patients don't go back to the referrers and complain of dysphotopsia, which they might do with a full range of vision lens. So you can target a bit of mini monovision for spectacle independence. Also, to remember that monovision is reversible, right? If they have problems driving at night, they put on a pair of glasses just for those long night drives when it's raining and the conditions aren't good, and all of a sudden the vision's perfect. So there's a kind of get out of jail card as well. So I really do love this lens, and I get asked to talk about a lot of different Rayner technology, which is a great privilege. But this is one that is like really the kind of a foundation of my lens practice, my advanced technology lens practice, and has been for at least 4 or 5 years now, with many happy patients. So it's something I have a lot of confidence in recommending to other surgeons.
Allon, for mentioning glasses as a refractive surgeon as a solution, you should be struck off. But otherwise, there were some great tips. It's really good.
Well, we did say it's all about happy patients, right?
Well, thank you both so much for joining me for this historic moment. FDA approval of the EMV Toric, it's a major milestone. I'm super excited for US surgeons and their patients. I hope that the US surgeons can learn from our experiences elsewhere and enjoy great outcomes. For those US surgeons just starting out with the lens, be sure to listen to our previous episodes discussing the EMV, including chats with inventor Graham Barrett and other chats with Allon Barsam himself. I'll look forward to seeing you both in person. And to our listeners, I'll talk to you again soon on the next episode of Peer2Peer. But thank you guys very much.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure. I enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.